Flight Dreams, a Mark Manning mystery, Book 1. Author, Michael Kraft. Publisher, Open Road Integrated Media, New York. Narrator, Eric Ost. Wednesday, December 30th. 2 days till deadline. The cab is cold. Manning nestles into his camel hair topcoat, which isn't buttoned because of the cast on his arm. Clearly, he's in for a period of readjustment. Manning returned from Phoenix late Monday, lucky to have a confirmed seat on Carter Air, one of the few airlines not affected by a spreading mechanic strike. His flight arrived on time at O'Hare, and the city had dug itself out of the worst of the Christmas storm. Things were returning to normal, and it felt good to be back in the hub of activity, back to work in spite of the splendid weather he left in Arizona, in spite of the man he left behind, wishing a bittersweet farewell that was peppered with mutual promises to think it through, work it out, get it settled. Tuesday was hectic, catching up at his desk and preparing for the opening of the Houseman trial. He spent most of the afternoon with his editor, Gordon Smith, and with Arthur Mendel's lawyer, Roxanne Exner, reviewing background and strategies for their day in court. Both Manning and Roxanne were careful to keep the conversation on a professional level, avoiding personal matters, particularly the trip to Phoenix. Roxanne knew that Manning had been there, but she was not yet prepared to hear any of what transpired with Neil, and Manning was not yet willing to reveal that he'd found Helena Carter. Roxanne explained that the Houseman trial, the hearing, would be held in Cook County Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Clement Ambrose, whom she described as classically crusty but fair. When the case was assigned to him, he expressed grave reservations as to whether the inquest was warranted by the known facts of the case. Nearly refusing to hear it, he was aware, though, that the publicity surrounding the case would easily entice less scrupulous judges to accept it. There were also the interest and pressures of the Archdiocese to consider, so he amended his schedule to accommodate the opening session during the last week of the year. Roxanne cautioned Manning to be wary of Hank Ferret, Helena Carter's court-appointed guardian ad litem. Apparently, Humphrey Hastings and his buddy Deputy Police Superintendent Murphy invited Ferret out for a working lunch. Hastings later bragged to a lawyer acquaintance of Roxanne's that it took precisely 2 cocktails to convince Ferret to assume the prosecutor's role in the proceeding, and it is Ferret who has subpoenaed Manning to deliver testimony at the fact-finding inquest. In the cab now, Wednesday morning, traffic is slow between the Journal offices and the Loop. So Manning burrows deeper into the collar of his coat, slouching with his head resting on the back of the seat. Clearing his mind, he slips into a dreamlike state. His brain is awake, but devoid of words, of syntax, of language itself. His awareness consists only of fleeting images, overarching perceptions. He feels as rested as on the first morning in Phoenix. Then he awoke to find Neil shaking his shoulder. His trip, he knows, was inevitable, but it wasn't fate that took him out to the desert. It wasn't destiny. He had decided to go there. He willed it. He thinks of Neil. His mind blossoms with the textures of their contact, the sounds and smells of their intimacy. He thinks of Helena Carter. He is dazzled by the henna brilliance of her hair, by the truth and wonder in her eyes. He thinks of his own future. His mind is awash with vague options for happiness. The uncertainties that lie ahead invigorate him. He feels no fear. Daily Center, croaks the cabbie, yanking Manning from his Revier. Handing the driver some bills, leaving the cab, he reminds himself the next few days will be the most difficult of his career, with the full assault of reality, to say nothing of the Arctic downdrifts that whip through the plaza. Manning suspects that his bout of euphoria should be dismissed as the after-effects of painkillers. He was fed in the hospital. The monumental Picasso bird woman dog looks down on him with a wry, shifting glance. Transmitter vans from a half-dozen television stations line the curb. Manning enters the glass and steel monolith of Daily Center and stands still for a moment, letting his senses adjust to the interior space. A commotion at the far end of the lobby stirs his reporter's instincts, drawing him toward the fray, like bouncers at some trendy night spot. Two guards check credentials, allowing some of the people in the crowd to board a single elevator, but turning away others who howl their protest. Drawing nearer, Manning discovers that the elevator is whisking express to one of the large upper floor courtrooms, where the Houseman trial will soon begin. Nudging his way to one of the guards, he flashes his press pass. The guard squints at it, then at Manning's face, then back at the card. He laughs awkwardly and says, "Of course, Mr. Manning. How stupid of me. This way, sir." He clears a path to the elevator door, admonishing the crowd to step aside. Inside the elevator, the others fell silent. As Manning enters and the doors slide closed, the ride is obligingly brief, punctuated by coughs and whispers, as they rise 20-some stories. When the doors open into the upper lobby, Manning strides out from the huddle behind him and into the glare of cameras assembled there to meet him. A network television reporter charges forward with the ferocity of a quarterback, flashes two perfect rows of capped teeth, and intones, "Can you give us any clues, Mr. Manning, as to what strategy you plan for today's showdown with your opponent, Humphrey, the Hump Hastings?" "Mr. Hastings is in no sense my opponent," Manning begins, while a battery of microphones are thrust under his chin. "I have no idea what motivated his various allegations, but I assume I've been called to act as a character witness on behalf of Arthur Mendel. I hope I can help him." A stunningly attractive woman, dressed more like a fashion model than a reporter, asks, "How does it feel to be on the other side of an interview for a change?" The cluster of reporters look to him with special attention. He says flatly, honestly, "It amuses me." There is a round of laughter, the laughter of comrades basking in the shared glow of workfellows' glory, laughter tempered only by their envy. "Mr. Manning," says a short young reporter with thick glasses who holds a microphone from one of the local stations. He speaks with an aggressive voice meant to compensate for his stunted height. "Your employer, the Journal, has access to the most high-powered legal talent in the city. Who are your editors sending to represent you this morning?" "I'll stand alone," Manning says. "I'll answer any questions put to me, and I'll speak for myself." "Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen?" the female reporter coos to her audience. "An astonishing act of courage," proclaims the network man through his capped teeth. But, stammers the little reporter who asked the question. A guard ushers Manning through the doors of the courtroom itself, leaving the gapping and babbling, the glare of TV lights behind in the hall, taking his seat in the front row of the gallery. Manning estimates that the room can accommodate perhaps 100 spectators. It bears scarce resemblance to the movie settings for trials held in turn-of-the-century courthouses. This room has no windows. It's boxy and sterile, painted white with a 10-foot ceiling, composed of acoustical tile interspersed with oblong rectangles of fluorescent lighting. The bench itself is raised, but only a step or two because of the low ceiling, flanked on one side by the American flag and on the other by that of Cook County. A sheriff's deputy, the court clerk, and a stenographer stand gabbing near the bench, sipping coffee from foam cups, waiting for the show to start. Jerry Klein and Arthur Mendel sit at a table near the front of the room with Roxanne and an assistant who busily prepare stacks of briefs, notes, and accounts. At a similar table sits a dapper attorney who Manning assumes to be Hank Ferret. He lounges in his chair with his legs crossed at the knees, watching the activity at Roxanne's table with a vague, detached curiosity. In contrast to Ferret's easy manner, his young underling, also at the table, appears jittery and preoccupied, thumbing through a thin pile of notes. Behind them, seated among a group of reporters, Humphrey Hastings picks his teeth with the cap of a ballpoint pen. Cameras are not allowed in Illinois courts, so the hearing will be aired on radio. Technicians fidget with bouquets of microphones placed at the lawyers' tables, the witness stand, and the judge's chair at the bench. Several sketch artists who will render these scenes in colored chalk for newspapers and television make quick study drawings of the room, of the lawyers, of Manning himself. Manning suddenly realizes that he will not be able to report on the hearing because of his own role in it, and he wonders if the Journal has thought to send another reporter. turning in his seat to scour the rapidly filling gallery for a familiar face. He is relieved to spot one of his associates, who waves his reporter's notebook and flashes Manning the OK sign. The deputy announces that all should rise as Judge Clement Ambrose emerges from his chambers to take his place at the bench. He is a shrunken man who walks with a hobble, his robes crossing the floor in jerky black puffs. A thin smile reveals a kindly, fatherly nature, while a glimmer in his eye betrays a smoldering wrath that he sometimes vents in the dispensing of justice. Seating himself, he nods to the others in the room, who then resume their own seats. Normally absorbed by every detail of an event he is covering for the journal, Manning feels his mind go blank during the opening procedures of the hearing. He is here in court, after all, as a participant, not a paid spectator, and he is concerned with only two questions. What will they ask? How will I answer? Manning consciously shifts his attention to Hank Ferret, who now stands for his opening statement. Ferret tugs once briskly at his lapels, then strokes his moused temples with the palms of both hands. He straightens his tie and steps forward. If it please the court, he begins in a deep, booming tone developed for just such occasions. We have lived for nearly 7 years in the anguish of doubt that has surrounded the disappearance and, alas, the probable death of Helena Carter. Ferret turns from the judge and strikes a pose for the gallery, prompting an audible scratching of sketchbooks from the row of artists. She was a fine woman, a good woman, a woman of faith who was deeply religious, a humanitarian who loved animals. Humphrey Hastings licks his lips. But she has been snatched from our midst, the lawyer laments. Is there still reason to cling to any shred of hope that she might again grace the North Shore with her benign presence? This is the question we hope to answer through the inquest that begins today. We are not here to accuse, but to learn, not to punish, but to vindicate. We have called here author Mendel Hausman to Helena Carter for many years, that he might share with us any knowledge, any insights into the circumstances that led to his employer's disappearance. Let us go forward then with this fact-finding mission in a spirit of candor and open-mindedness, that the cause of justice may be served and that Mrs. Carter's estate may be expeditiously settled according to the terms of her will. Thank you. He ends with a sweep of his arm that could pass for a Shakespearean bow, drawing a smatter of applause from pockets of the gallery. Humphrey Hastings claps far more loudly than the others, causing Ferret a tinge of embarrassment as he returns to his seat. Judge Ambrose snuffs the demonstration with a single slam of his gavel, then turns to Roxanne. Well, Miss Exner, he says with a smile, I assume Madame Counsel has a few thoughts of her own on this matter. Do you wish to respond with an opening statement? I do, Your Honor. Roxanne rises and turns to the gallery. A gleam of resolution flashes in her eyes as she weighs her thoughts, focusing on the faces that peer back at her. The silence is broken only by the muffled abrasion of colored chalk on paper. She finally says, I'm directing my comments to you, spectators from the general public, and representatives of the press, because there's no jury in this courtroom. Her voice is clear, loud, and deliberately unladylike, delivering her message in sharp, staccato jabs. There's no jury because this is not a trial. I urge you all to remember that basic fact and to dismiss the sensational nonsense you've been reading that has led to this opening session of the so-called Hausman trial. But I repeat, this is not a trial, merely hearing. No one has been charged with a crime, and there's not a scrap of evidence that would warrant charges. Remember that as this inquisition unfolds. Remember that as you observe the techniques of my skilled colleague, Mr. Ferret. Remember that as you witness the unconscionable spectacle of unspecified charges being leveled for unspecified crimes. And remember it, you who hold the power to inform the masses as you rush from this room to milk news from this hearing. A hearing that was spawned without justification and that will produce nothing of substance except the unprovoked humiliation of an innocent man. Remember it. She spins on her heel and sits. The crowd stares, stunned. Even the artists have abandoned the drawings that lie in their laps. Arthur Mendel seems more frightened by the lull than comforted by her words of defense. The filthy bitch, Hastings tells himself, putting down his pen. He decides that not a single word of Roxanne's will appear in the Post. Not in his paper, by God. Thank you, Miss Exner, says Judge Ambrose. Your point is well made and forcefully stated. We'll all try to keep in mind the issues you raised. Now, Mr. Ferret, he swings his head. Please call your first witness. Ferret calls the police detective to the stand. The officer is sworn in, then proceeds to answer a long string of questions from Ferret regarding the underworld connections of many famous and infamous horse racing figures. The questioning is structured to leave the impression that anyone involved in any way with horses, as Mendel was, must necessarily have connections with organized crime. The questioning also reveals to Manning's amusement that neither Ferret nor Hastings has discovered Mendel's past gambling peccadillo, which could have been used to build a far more incriminating argument. Roxanne listens, refraining from the objection she could easily raise. When at last it is her turn to cross-examine the witness, she has but one question. Do you know of any evidence linking Arthur Mendel to the disappearance of Helena Carter? The detective answers, No, ma'am, and Roxanne dismisses him. Hastings' lips curl into a pout. Ferret calls a psychiatrist to the stand and questions him on various aspects of the criminal mind, leaving the impression that any man who has spent his career in a role servile to a woman would eventually have to strike out against that woman as a means of asserting his manhood and restoring self-esteem. In extreme cases, murder might well be the unhappy resolution to a situation described by the doctor as psychologically untenable. When Roxanne cross-examines the witness, she again poses the question. Do you know of any evidence linking Arthur Mendel to the disappearance of Helena Carter? The doctor answers, No, ma'am, and is dismissed. Hastings fumes. Ferret then questions the county coroner on techniques for disposing of a body under various circumstances, failing to include, Manning notes, the possibilities presented by concrete or construction sites. The coroner describes an array of grisly procedures glossed over with technical jargon, rendering his morbid expertise unemotional and businesslike. He leaves the impression that if a person set out to destroy the mortal remains of a victim, it is a task that any clever child might accomplish. Roxanne again asks her sole question. The coroner responds that he knows of no such evidence. He is dismissed. Similar examinations and cross-examinations take place with a bank president, a priest, a jockey, a forensic pathologist, a parade of expert witnesses. Roxanne begins to wonder if Ferret will ever call Mark Manning or Arthur Mendel. She herself is determined not to call them to the stand, but she is surprised that Ferret has not yet lunged. It's nearly 1 o'clock, and the proceeding has grown sluggish. Attorneys and witnesses alike are getting hungry and irritable. Judge Ambrose finally asks the two lawyers to approach the bench. He asks how many witnesses they still intend to call, wondering if they should first break for lunch. A murmur swells from the gallery. Humphrey Hastings, straining to hear what is being said, slips from the edge of his chair. Fumbling, he spares himself the ignominy of landing on the floor. Before calling our star witnesses, Ferret confides with a wink that makes Roxanne want to slap him, I'd like to question Mrs. Carter's sister, Margaret O'Connor, but I'm amazed that I haven't seen her. Your Honor, Roxanne interrupts, Miss O'Connor is not here today. Jerry Klein tells me that she preferred not to attend, finding the proceeding too painful. If called, however, she will willingly testify. The judge turns from Roxanne to Ferret. Well, counsel, he says, it seems you won't be questioning Miss O'Connor today. Do you wish to go ahead and call Arthur Mendel? No, Your Honor. That can wait. How about you, Miss Exner? Any witnesses you wish to call today? She begins to answer in the negative, then stops herself, reconsidering. She says aloud, for all to hear, "Yes, Your Honor, I would like to call a final witness. Mark Manning." The murmur from the gallery immediately surges into a crossfire of excited discussion. Judge Ambrose raps for order and calls Manning to the stand. An expectant smile spreads across Humphrey Hastings' face, and he watches with a predatory stare as Manning is sworn in and seated. Roxanne asks her witness, "Is it true, Mr. Manning, that in the course of your investigative reporting of the Carter case, you've had occasion to interview the family houseman, Arthur Mendel?" Roxanne's delivery sounds cool and prosaic, as though she had never met the man she now questions. "Yes, Miss Exner, I spoke with Mr. Mendel at length on 2 occasions in October." Manning's mind snaps into focus as he falls into the expected pattern of questions and answers. "And what was the purpose of those interviews? Did you plan to write a story about him?" "No, I wasn't planning a specific story. They were background interviews. I had reported events surrounding the Carter disappearance since the day after it happened. And though I'd met Arthur, I'd never interviewed him because there was no reason to think he was involved. But since his name kept popping up as a possible suspect," Roxanne asked, "You mean in Humphrey Hastings' articles in the Post?" "Exactly. Because the Post repeatedly named him as a suspect, I decided to talk to Arthur simply as a means of confirming, in my own mind, his non-involvement." "You've been reporting for the Journal for how long, Mr. Manning?" "Nearly 20 years. I joined the paper right out of college." "Your reputation for the work you've done there is widely known among the press. At the risk of embarrassing you, Mr. Manning, would it be accurate to say that you are generally respected for your fairness, your thoroughness, and your judgment?" "That would be accurate," he replies, not at all embarrassed. "You think of yourself, then, as a good judge of character. That's an important part of your job, isn't it?" "Yes, Mrs. Exner." "Tell us, then, what conclusions you drew from your discussions with Arthur Mendel." Manning smiles. "After some initial doubts, I found it inconceivable that he could be in any way involved with Mrs. Carter's disappearance. In fact, I know that he is innocent." Hank Ferret shoots to his feet. "Your Honor, the witness is expressing opinions. Mr. Manning's statement is irrelevant to this proceeding." "Don't be silly, counsel," the judge snaps at Ferret. "All character witnesses are called to express their opinions, and Miss Exner has demonstrated that Mr. Manning's opinion in this matter is indeed relevant." Objection overruled. "Sit down, Mr. Ferret." He cracks his gavel and turns to Roxanne. "Please continue." Taking an unexpected turn, she asks, "Mr. Manning, has your involvement with this case proved in any way threatening to your health?" Ferret is again on his feet. "Your Honor, I must object. Madame Counsel's transparent attempts to dramatize the witness's bandaged arm is obviously a sympathy ploy beneath the dignity of this court." With a menacing leer, Judge Ambrose tells him, "Overruled." "I'm intrigued by the question. The witness will please answer." Manning says, "Yes, my life has been threatened twice." His words are met with astonished mutterings. "My arm was broken a few days ago in an auto accident resulting from potentially lethal mischief that seems clearly related to the Carter case. I do not know who was responsible. Early on October 19th, I received a death threat in the mail. I have never taken the October incident seriously, however." Roxanne asks, "Do you still have this letter?" "Right here," Manning answers, reproducing the envelope. Roxanne has Manning read the insipid note into the record. Then she has it entered into evidence and hands it to Judge Ambrose, who studies it closely. The judge asks Manning, "Do you have any idea who sent this?" "Yes, Your Honor. I know exactly who sent it." The judge's eyes pop. "Who?" Manning tells him. "Humphrey Hastings, reporter for the Post." Pandemonium, the crowd's whispers explode into whoops of dismay. Reporters scribble ecstatically. This is the stuff they've been waiting for. And a veritable cloud of chalk dust rises over the heads of the sketch artists. Hank Ferret screams his objections. Judge Ambrose hammers over the din, and Humphrey Hastings sits with his mouth agape, a numbed, quivering blob in a bow tie. When a semblance of order has been restored, the judge asked, "Can you substantiate this charge, Mr. Manning?" "Indeed I can," says Manning. Everyone in court listens engrossed as Manning recounts the events of the day when he received the letter. He points out the post watermark on the stationery. He notes certain tendencies in Hastings' writing style, including overuse of the word modicum. He explains the distinctive little E's typical of old newsroom typewriters, adding, "Mr. Hastings once told me at a party that he writes all his stories on an ancient underwood. I'm certain, Your Honor, that if you impound his typewriter and examine its type, you'll find that it produced the letter in evidence." Judge Ambrose instantly dispatches 2 deputies to the post building to confiscate the machine, making the order official with a pound of his gavel. A hush falls over the courtroom. All eyes turn to Humphrey Hastings, who hasn't moved, hasn't spoken. He peers at the judge for a moment, then shifts his gaze to Ferret, to Manning, to Roxanne, then back to the judge. Moments pass. Silence reigns. The room closes in on him. "No!" wails Hastings. "It wasn't signed!" He flails both arms at the heavens. "You can't prove it! You can't prove a thing!" In a comfortable chair in a little stucco house in Assumption, Helena Carter listens to Hastings' outburst on the radio. Abe, the greatest of all champion Abyssinians, lies curled in her lap. Abe's tail, tipped with hairs of purest black, just touches his brick-red nose. The cat's slow, easy breathing gently parts the black tuft of fur with machine-like regularity. The woman sits perfectly still, except for one of her thumbs, which strokes Abe behind the ears. She is the picture of contentment, but her mind is troubled. She hears the uproar that now fills the courtroom. She hears Judge Ambrose hopelessly gabble for silence. She hears the words of an announcer describing the scene. She hears the churning of her own brain, burdened for days with the decision she must soon reach. "Your Honor!" Hank Ferret's voice barks through the mayhem. "I most strenuously object to Miss Exner's line of questioning. I demand that the witness's testimony be stricken." "Overruled?" the judge blasts back at him. Then in a civil, normal tone he asks, "Miss Exner, have you any more questions for this witness?" "No, Your Honor." The judge asks Ferret, "Well, counsel, I suppose you'd like to cross-examine?" Soft voice, but eager, Ferret replies, "Indeed I would." There is a moment's quiet while the lawyer approaches the witness stand. "Mr. Manning," he asks, his tone suggesting that a new thought has occurred to him, "do you feel, as you implied by your testimony, that it was somehow improper for the Chicago Post, which happens to be your employer's principal competitor, to name suspects in the Carter case?" "Yeah, it was highly improper," says Manning. "To publicly accuse a man without evidence, even if motivated by the so-called public interest, that's not the function of journalism." "I see. Could you share with us, Mr. Manning, your more highly evolved philosophy of journalism?" "It's not a philosophy, but simply a matter of definition. The reporter's job is to report the news, not to make news. He deals only in facts, striving to report them in a concise and intelligible manner. It is the reader's task to understand those facts and to interpret them." "But we don't always have the facts, do we, Mr. Manning? Sometimes we have to rely upon our beliefs." "Not in news reporting. Beliefs are always personal, usually meaningless, and sometimes dangerous. Beliefs are never knowledge. By their nature, they refute knowledge and dismiss facts." "Come now," clucks Ferret as if he has trapped a child in a ridiculous fib. "Are you trying to tell us there is no room in the world for belief or trust?" or faith? Do you never act on a hunch? Of course I do. Sometimes we're forced to, when we don't have sufficient facts. That would allow us to act on the basis of knowledge. We must make decisions and take actions based on our best judgment. That's acting on a hunch, a belief. But my point is this, Mr. Ferret. When I'm stuck with a hunch, I don't write about it. A stir of muted voices affirms that the crowd in the courtroom has been swayed by Manning, but Ferret presses on. It's easy to point the finger, isn't it, Mr. Manning? But fingers point both ways, you know? You have upbraided Humphrey Hastings for accusing Arthur Mendel in his columns, yet I distinctly heard you say of Mendel, he is innocent. Isn't that a belief on your part? Haven't you acted on a hunch in so judging him? No. Manning's voice is clear, his manner resolute. The innocence of Arthur Mendel is not a belief on my part. It is knowledge. Oh, really? Says Ferret with a sneer. Do please enlighten us with the precious facts that enable you to make such a judgment. Manning pauses before answering. For 7 years, I have reported details suggesting that Helena Carter is not dead, but has disappeared of her own willing. No one else has followed this reasoning or drawn this conclusion. Now, I tell you, the woman is alive. This is a fact. But those who would profit from her death are no more likely to accept facts than they are able to understand reasoning. Ferret says, What makes you so certain that Mrs. Carter is alive? Manning replies, I could tell you that Helena Carter has not been murdered. I could tell you that I've recently seen her, sat with her, spoken with her at length. I could tell you all these things, but you wouldn't believe me. I could swear to these things, but you'd accuse me of perjury. I could tell you precisely how I know the things I know, but I won't. Ferret says slyly, A wise decision. No, Mr. Manning, I wouldn't believe you. Yes, I'd accuse you of perjury. If the things you said were true, there'd be no need for this hearing today. If your words were true, Ferret breaks into loud laughter, you'd be a very lucky, rather wealthy man. The crowd laughs nervously with Ferret, shifting its fickle allegiance. Judge Ambrose raps his gavel, and the disturbance is quickly quelled. Your Honor, says Ferret, his voice still shaky with waning spasms of laughter, I believe the credibility of this witness has been sufficiently demonstrated. I have no further questions. The judge addresses the assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, these proceedings have taken far longer than planned. It's well past my lunchtime, and Mr. Mendel has yet to testify. To the parties who have an interest in Mrs. Carter's estate, it is important that we resolve these matters before New Year's Day, so we will meet again tomorrow afternoon, December 31st at 1 o'clock. At that time, Mr. Manning, you will substantiate your fantastic claims to Mr. Ferret, or you will be held in contempt of this court. We stand adjourned. At the sound of the gavel, background jabber fills the room, and the hushed-toned announcer begins his needless summary of what the listening audience has just heard. Excuse me, Abe, Helena Carter tells the cat as she lifts him from her lap and sets him on the floor next to her chair. She rises, crosses the room, and switches off the radio. When she returns to the chair, Abe leaps into her lap and resumes his nap, bearing no apparent grudge for the intrusion. The woman gives a chesty sigh as she settles back with her thoughts. She tells herself that Mark Manning's life has been threatened as a result of her soul-searching escapade. She thinks of Humphrey Hastings, a man she does not know but instinctively dislikes, and feels a pang of sympathy even for him. Aware that his wrongdoing was inspired by an overzealous response to her disappearance, she thinks of her sister and Arthur Mendel. My dear, yes, Margaret and Arthur, soon to be questioned in court like criminals. What effect would that have on them, especially after living through the uncertainties and the bleak suspicions of the past 7 years? Arthur has been a steadfast friend of the family for over 30 years. And Margaret, well, that indiscretion was long ago forgiven. She's still the little sister, and she's going through hell. It's gone too far, Helen tells herself. It's gone on too long. It's time to put an end to this nonsense. She knows what needs to be done. She must speak to her brother, Father James McMullen, and she knows when to do it. The priest sent a note to her today asking her to come to the church tomorrow morning, early at 5 o'clock, to celebrate with him a private mass of thanksgiving for the good fortune that is about to befall Assumption. She tells herself the first mass of the day is normally at 6. Why is it so important for them to be alone? Just as well, though. Their discussion is not apt to be pleasant. Secure in her thoughts, she rolls her fingers under Abe's chin and ponders the conclusion she has reached. Abe purrs. "No!" wails Humphrey Hastings. "It wasn't signed." At home on a mountainside in Phoenix, Neil crouches before his television set, watching an evening news report of the Houseman trial. Earlier at work, he tried to follow the live radio coverage, but he was busy today, and the constant interruptions made it difficult for him to make sense of the disembodied voices. He wanted to close his office door, clear his desk, and just listen, but an important project was still overdue. Manning's belated Christmas present. And he had to hustle to get it finished in time for the 4:30 FedEx pickup. It will arrive tomorrow morning, something to perk up Manning's day before things get ugly in court. Neil sits cross-legged on the floor now, no more than 3 feet from the picture tube. "You can't prove it! You can't prove a thing!" The recording of Hastings' outburst continues to play while a sequence of chalk drawings flashes on the screen, depicting the dramatic moment as a smidge more dramatic than it actually was. Neil watches vacantly as a panel of law and journalism experts analyzes events of the day's hearing. They all agree that as far as Manning and Hastings are concerned, the result of tomorrow's court session will surely make one of them and break the other. They then play the portion of Manning's testimony in which he hints that he has recently talked to Carter herself. One of the panelists comments, "It seems to me that Mr. Manning was indulging here in a bit of gaming with Hank Ferret." Manning stated, after all, that he would not swear to his outlandish claims concerning Mrs. Carter, shrewdly avoiding the possibility of perjury charges, yet at the same time managing to tantalize both Ferret and Judge Ambrose. What did Manning mean by this cryptic exchange? I'm afraid that's anyone's guess, but one thing is clear. It is now presumed with near certainty that Mrs. Carter has been dead since her disappearance 7 years ago. So it's unlikely that Manning meant for us to take literally his claim of having spoken with her. Perhaps he has had a mystical experience. Perhaps he is himself clairvoyant or has spoken with the deceased heiress through the aid of a medium. I doubt if we shall ever know the exact meaning of Mark Manning's words. Neil knows the meaning of Manning's words. They can be taken literally at face value, with no hidden message whatever. These idiots on TV have been told point blank the answer to this whole trumped-up mystery, and they don't even have the presence of mind to recognize it. But Neil knows that Manning is right, that Manning would not expect anyone to accept his words on faith, that Manning must have a plan. Neil certainly hopes that Manning has a plan, because at this moment, his prospects appear chancy at best. Neil leans back, supporting his weight on his elbows, and breathes an impatient sigh. The news program ends, followed by a Fox Network jiggle rerun from the pre-Beefcake era, beloved by the masses for its wet t-shirts, sniggering innuendo, and precocious smart-mouth kids. But Neil is not aware of the show. Not even the noisy strobe-flashing commercials are able to steal his attention and penetrate his thoughts. Neil tells himself Mark has been gone from Phoenix for only 2 days now, without him. The 4 days we spent together seemed like the compression of a lifetime, as though we were always so near, as though it could never have been any other way, as though nothing could ever change. But things have changed. Mark is gone. We're going to think things over. We'll torture ourselves with a separation intended to clear our minds and make our true desires known, unclouded by momentary passions or the urgency of lust. These things take time. These things take a level head. Infatuation is a poor foundation for decisions that change a person's life. We'll have to endure this a little longer. Another month, perhaps a year. And then what? Either I go to him or I stay. In a month or in a year or not at all. The waiting no longer makes sense. Neil knows his mind. He knows what he must do. "Oh, Daddy!" yells the busty adolescent on the screen. She's been helping wash the family minivan, and now Daddy's getting tricksy with the hose. Neil snorts a derisive laugh. With his toe, he reaches up and punches the button that blackens the screen. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.